So thank you everyone for coming today. Today is our final event for Refugee and Migrant Advocacy Week. All week we have been doing programs focusing on refugee advocacy. On Tuesday, we had an event focusing specifically on the New York City migrant crisis. Yesterday, we had an event focusing on LGBTQ plus refugees in Kenya. And today we are honored to have three panelists talking about the Biden administration's refugee and southern border policies. So just a little background on Refugee Advocacy Week. We started it last year in partnership with the Holocaust Genocide and Interfaith Education Center and Campus Ministry and Social Action. The reason we started it was to take refugee advocacy beyond the headlines of the news. I created an event during the Afghanistan crisis and the refugees that were coming over to the US. But we really felt that there are so many displacement crises in the world going on, with now over 108 million people displaced, that we really needed to have an advocacy week to take it beyond just what the news is showing with Afghanistan and Ukraine. So with that being said, we are honored to have three guests today. They are from local organizations, national organizations, and they are here not only to talk about Biden administration's policies, but also how we as college students can get involved. So first, we have Russ. He is from HIAS. We have Julia. She is from JRS, which is Jesuit Refugee Services, hosted in DC. And last but not least, we have Kathie from Hearts and Homes for Refugees. So Russ, if you want to start and introduce yourself and HIAS a little bit, that would be great.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And it is an honor and a pleasure to get to be here with these fantastic panelists and to be part of this week of programming. Thank you for the invitation. It's really wonderful to be here. So my name is Russ Agdern. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the grassroots organizing and advocacy manager for HIAS. HIAS is one of the 10 refugee resettlement organizations in the United States, which means we work to help resettle refugees that come through the United States Refugee Assistance Program, the State Department. But we also do a whole lot more than that. We are global in our presence, working with refugees, asylum seekers, and displaced people in, I want to say, I believe we're at, it's over 20 countries across the world. And our work started in the late 19th century, working to help support Jews who were coming to the United States, and that was sort of the base of the program for a significant amount of time until the later part of the 20th century, where our work transitioned to not just supporting Jews, but working to support refugees of all races, religions, nationalities, and backgrounds, and building out our presence throughout the country through local resettlement and also throughout the world in terms of humanitarian support. There's a lot more to say, but I know our other panelists have a lot to say about their incredible work, so I'm going to pause there.
Thank you, Russ. Julia, would you like to introduce yourself in JRS?
Yes, thanks so much, Chris, and thanks for having me as well. It's great to be here. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. So I'm Julia McPherson. I'm the Vice President of Advocacy and Operations at Jesuit Refugee Service USA, based in Washington, D.C. We are an international Catholic humanitarian organization working in 58 countries around the world, specifically focused on refugees and other forcibly displaced persons. So we've been operating since 1980. We were founded by Father Pedro Arrupe, who was the head of the Jesuits, which is a Catholic order of priests and brothers at that time. And he wanted to respond to the Vietnamese boat people crisis. And since that first intervention, we're now intervening across the globe and focusing specifically on a few different things in our overseas work. We provide access to education for refugees and other displaced persons. We also invest in programs focused on mental health and psychosocial support. And depending on the country and the context, we also offer some legal representation, legal services, reconciliation programs. Really depends on the country and the context. In addition to the overseas work, we do have a few domestic programs. One at the border in El Paso. It's a binational program with our colleagues in Mexico. And through that program, we offer legal services and mental health and psychosocial support services to migrants and asylum seekers. And then we also have a long-standing program. It's actually a contract that we have with the Department of Homeland Security for a chaplaincy initiative. So there are 5 federal detention centers, and we have a chaplain in each of those detention centers that offers religious services of any faith background for the detainees. So, so 2 sort of specific domestically focused interventions that we work on. And then my role, as you can tell from my title, is focused on advocacy. So looking forward to having some conversations around the current policies that are impacting some of our work.
Thank you, Julia. Kathie, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thanks for pulling this very important event together. It's nice to see my colleagues in this space, Julia and Russ. Also, I want to acknowledge that in the audience is Lori Kapner-Haas, board member and volunteer extraordinaire with Hearts and Homes for Refugees. And I was going to be there with her today, but I am under the weather. And so she's there, but has some materials. And also we'll probably talk about after we hang up, the Students for Refugees group, because she is there to inspire some students to possibly start a Students for Refugees chapter at Manhattan College. So Hearts and Homes for Refugees is a more local, nonprofit grassroots organization that I started 8 years ago with the intention of welcoming and resettling refugees, and also to inspire, educate, and equip others to do the same. The mission wasn't just to welcome one family. We wanted it to be something bigger because we knew this was possible. And 8 years later, you can see throughout the lower Hudson Valley a number of community-sponsored groups, thousands of refugees, and Hearts and Homes has been leading that movement since 2016. We bring together and engage community partners from faith groups, interfaith groups, civic groups, to be a part of the scaffolding of support around refugees. And we follow the community sponsorship model, which is addressing every need from the moment a refugee arrives at the airport, of housing, furnishing, navigating the medical needs in the community, the cultural orientation and community adaptation. We really build the support and scaffolding in ways that you can imagine anyone coming to a country without the language, without the culture, and having fled their own country, not because they chose to, but because they were forced to flee. So there are many opportunities for people to get involved. And that's one of the things that we do, is we identify ways that anyone could be involved in this work, whether it's, driving once a month to fully leading a cohort of volunteers. So we said 6, 7, 8 years ago that if you build it, they will come. And we convinced HIAS and Catholic Charities to come to Westchester County. And they have been incredible partners in resettlement with Hearts and Homes and with other community sponsor groups. So thanks to them and to the IRC and Church World Service, because without those partners in community sponsorship, this would not have been possible. I'll talk a little later when you ask questions about it, how this model is expanding and why there is hope for the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here today. So since this is a reflection on the Biden administration's policies in regards to the southern border and refugees, why don't we start at the very beginning of the Biden administration with Title 42 during COVID-19, even though this policy was implemented during the Trump administration. So I'll have Russ, if you feel comfortable starting, what is Title 42 for those of us that don't know or need a refresher? And what impact did it have on the United States immigration system?
Sure. Thank you so much. Title 42. Title 42 is actually was a workaround. Basically, it was. I'm going to try to. I'm going to give you the answer and also sort of break down how it worked. And obviously, both Julia and Kathie, I'm sure, have plenty to say about how Title 42 has impacted everything. So it was actually a medical code, and it was used by the Trump administration to stop people from coming across the border for basically any reason whatsoever, on the grounds that while the emergency authorization, the national emergency for COVID-19 was in place, that people would not be allowed to come in and claim asylum. And this was already well in place by the time the Biden administration took office. What it basically did was it essentially ended the right to claim asylum, which is an internationally recognized right. It ended it here for several years until the emergency was lifted. And I mean, what that meant was that people who were, who are running away from home and were trying to seek a safe place to call home, a safe new place to call home and claim asylum here, running from whatever terrible, difficult, challenging things that they were trying to flee from to become, to be safe for themselves and their families, were not able to come across the border. And it meant that there were a lot of people that were basically trapped at the Mexico-U.S. border. And it meant that that problem was then also that was also a difficult moment for the people that were there, that were there waiting to try to find a way across in Mexico. It's difficult to overstate sort of how devastating that was for so many people who were just looking for an opportunity to try to come here and to have, to try to start some kind of a new life here. When the emergency authorization, I keep saying authorization because I think about the other piece of it, which is the COVID emergency, right? When the COVID emergency was ended, that ended the authority for the government to use Title 42 to keep people out. When the Biden administration did that, and I'll say, for folks who are still keeping their eye on the COVID-19 pandemic, right? The cost of that also is, right, vaccine costs go up for individuals. Tests are no longer free for a lot of people. They just reinstated a program after a long time of not having that. But one of the other, the other consequence of that is they needed to work to have something in place, some kind of system in place that would work to process people justly and fairly. And what instead happened, and this is jumping a little bit in terms of ahead, so maybe I'll stop here and see what Julia and Kathie have to add. But what instead happened is there were a bunch of things that the Biden administration put in place to replace Title 42, including some very difficult, problematic things that the previous administration had put in place in addition to Title 42. So we, so let me pause there and let Julia and Kathie jump in if you guys want to jump in and add.
Yeah, happy to add a few thoughts. That was a great overview, Russ. Maybe two points. One is just to emphasize how discriminatory this policy was. It was based in this public health emergency premise, but it targeted asylum seekers. So we know that during the COVID pandemic, there were people coming in and out of the United States constantly, right? There were no limitations on people arriving in the United States. except there was this barrier. This barrier was placed specifically for asylum seekers. So it was a way for the Trump administration, frankly, to implement a policy that limited or eliminated, right, access to asylum in this kind of backwards way. And unfortunately, it did take 3 years for the Biden administration to chip away at this the policy. There were some court efforts through the courts to terminate the policy, but eventually the only way to get around this was to terminate the entire public health emergency, to your point, Russ, which had other implications beyond access to asylum. So it was really rooted in the discriminatory approach and a lot of sort of politicization of this issue around asylum. And I would just secondly emphasize the impact it had in terms of maintaining or keeping everyone in limbo who were waiting at the border, created huge problems for the Mexican government. There's huge amounts of levels of violence, kidnapping, extortion at the border as a result. Smuggling increased significantly. So we saw higher numbers of people trying to access the border illegally. Most people patiently wait in line to access the border or to claim asylum at a port of entry. But when you're stuck for months, years on end without the opportunity to legally petition for asylum, that legal right that everyone has, then you become desperate, right? I think any of us can sympathize with that. And so we saw increased violence, we saw crowded shelters, we saw people taking extreme risks to enter the United States. And that unfortunately just adds to this negative rhetoric around migration, around asylum seekers, and created significant problems for those of us trying to serve those populations, but certainly for those caught up in this politicization of this policy. So yes, I know we'll get into sort of the next steps, but just to emphasize those 2 points.
I just want to say one thing about this. This is not something that Hearts and Homes has been active in, to be honest. Our mission is different, but I think the important thing to remember is that the politicization, making this such a political football has undermined what is a human right. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights said that seeking asylum is legal, and doing so gives everyone has the right to do so. We've lost sight of that, and I think this has just become a way to manage a really bad immigration policy in this country.
Russ, going back to one of the things you mentioned earlier about some of the replacements that the Biden administration tried to implement to discourage migrants coming from the southern border, one of those was making sure that asylum seekers first applied in the countries that they passed through. What is your perspective on that policy, and how has that complicated the work of HIAS, JRS, and other organizations focusing on asylum seekers?
Well, I mean, I'll say from our perspective, I mean, that is essentially that's essentially the Trump travel ban that was in place. That there was a ban that basically said if you were to pass through another country and not apply for asylum there, that you couldn't apply for asylum here, that you were not allowed to. And I mean, what makes that really frustrating is we had a candidate who campaigned very differently than that rule, that then went to re-implement a version of that rule. And in fact, we know that the ACLU, when it was fighting that rule, basically resubmitted the same lawsuit that they submitted to fight the Trump version, with almost no changes to it, because it was essentially the same thing. And HIAS also has both from with local organizations and our own work, we have a presence both in Mexico and on the other side of the border. And so we provide legal support and other support for folks as they're coming in and coming across. I think how that impacts our work is, we do the work that I do, similar to Julia. The work that I do is actually primarily working around advocacy and organizing, and I actually work with local leaders like Kathie and other local leaders across the country around working to build relationships with members of Congress and to try to push them to make more merciful, more just, more humane policy when it comes to refugees, asylum seekers, and displaced people across the world. So when we look at a policy like this, we have local leaders that have been doing this work for 7, 8 more years, and to have to go to them and say, well, remember this person you were excited to have be president. Well, we have to now fight this policy that we already fought under the previous administration. And I think it can be really, really frustrating for our advocacy work that we have to continue these battles. Julia, I'll throw it over to you.
Agreed. And in addition to this particular policy about sort of third country, forcing people to these third country agreements is what they're typically called, and forcing asylum seekers to petition for asylum in the first country of arrival. There were several other policies that the Biden administration introduced at the same time, including, for example, asylum seekers now need to use an app on a smartphone. It's called the CBP-1 app to schedule an appointment. With CBP-1, they have to be in another country before doing that. So typically they're in Mexico applying on an app for an interview and then have to wait for that interview. And imagine the complications around, whether or not an asylum seeker has access to a smartphone, the congestion in terms of scheduling an interview, the technical challenges around that. So there are many things that the Biden administration has sort of introduced in this period after Title 42. And frankly, it's become very challenging logistically, but also in terms of communication and information. And, it's hard for us as advocates sometimes to keep track of all of these different policies and how they're executed. Imagine being on the other side as a migrant or asylum seeker, trying to understand and comprehend how they can navigate this very complex situation. So it's been very difficult, I think, from an misinformation point of view, to really try to empower asylum seekers themselves and the organizations like ours, trying to help them to make sure that they don't inadvertently, cause issues for themselves, that they have a path to protection that makes sense and is easy to access. So unfortunately, it's become very complicated, very challenging, and we don't really see an end in sight. This needs a broader reform. That we all agree, I think, broader reform. The system needs to be more broadly reformed beyond these sort of patchwork interventions that unfortunately have negative consequences on the people they're theoretically trying to help.
I just want to add one piece to that. It's specifically the CBP-1, the app, is actually particularly challenging because, first of all, it doesn't really work well. Imagining whether you're, a life and death situation where you are trying to get your family to safety for a better life, and it's based on a wonky app that was so dysfunctional when it was first put out that within like a week or two of it being put out, Senator Markey put out a statement from Massachusetts, saying this app doesn't work. We need an alternative. And secondly, we have reports from our folks from the board, trying to, or folks working with people trying to get across the border, that there's some instances where when they have an appointment, they may get turned away by Border Patrol anyway. Even if they've got an appointment in the app, they may not be allowed to come across to have their appointment. So it's just, there's a lot of, just echoing Julia, there's several things in place, and they all need a lot of change to them.
And going back to President Biden's campaign promises in regards to immigration and refugees, a lot of the criticism of the Trump administration was with his travel ban we saw some of the lowest numbers in history in regards to the number of refugees we settled. However, in fiscal year 2022, the United States only resettled 25,465 refugees, despite the refugee cap being at 125,000. Similarly, in fiscal year 2023, the United States only resettled about 45,123 refugees as of September 20th, according to the Refugee Council USA. Why is the United States, one of the richest countries and most developed nations on earth, failing to max out its refugee cap, which to begin with isn't even 0.5% of the total refugees currently on the planet? And we'll start with Kathie.
Okay. Okay, let's put this in context, okay? The good news is that the refugee resettlement program is coming back, okay? Look back at what happened in 2016. For 4 years, the refugee admissions program was cut off at the knees. It was decimated. Infrastructure of settlement agencies was cut. Staffing was next to zero. Offices closed. So how can you resettle refugees through the US RAP program when there is no support for it? Biden comes in, ups the cap, and remember that presidential determination is just a cap, it's aspirational. So yes, in the last several years, the cap has been at 125, but the good news is in the last year, we have what was that number? We have resettled this year's number, okay, 60,000, which is where we'll probably end up at the end of September, the fiscal year, already surpasses the last 3 years combined, okay? Well, that's the good news. So the damage was done, the commitment is there, the resettlement agencies are building back. There's some other exciting things happening. The US government has recognized that private citizens can shift the paradigm of refugee resettlement in this country and are opening different pathways to resettlement. Private citizens can now opt in to resettle refugees through Welcome Corps, through the U4U program. Operation Allies Welcome is how nearly, 90,000 Afghans came into this country. The U4U program, Biden set the goal at 100,000. We're already up to 300,000 Ukrainians in this country. The reason they aren't counted is because they are coming in with other status, humanitarian parole. So they do not count toward the number of refugees through the US refugee admissions program. But there's been more resettlement of refugees in the broader sense than we've seen. I know World War II, 1948, there were 7 million from Europe, but this is a significant number of refugees in the broadest sense that have been allowed to come here and then resettled, many with the help of private citizens and the resettlement agencies that are becoming more robust all the time. This is going to continue, by the way, as the government invests in bold changes like these private citizen pathways, we will see more refugee resettlements. So that's the good news.
Kathie, could you explain for those in the audience that don't know the difference? Could you define very quickly what a refugee is? What are their rights and the aid that they receive as compared to someone who has the status of humanitarian parole?
So a refugee that arrives here has someone who's fled their country due to fear of persecution based on their race, religion, nationality, a number of reasons, but they've already been granted refugee status outside this country, okay? And they went through the United Nations High Commission on Refugees. They've been approved. The resettlement agencies select which clients they will take as refugees through their affiliate programs. So they are already approved. The humanitarian parole is a status that is given in an emergency situation, when the country has fallen to the Taliban, when a war erupts in Ukraine. Those are humanitarian paroles. They are receiving temporary status. A refugee comes here and they have permanent status. The Ukrainians and Afghans have temporary status, and they do not have a permanent path to be here for long. past the 2 years they're given. This is problematic because it sends everyone back to the legal system to get reparoled. They have started to resettle, and then all of a sudden their employment authorization is taken away or expires. There's so many problems with temporary protection status, as we've seen, but it is a status that is given because there was no time to process them as refugees. Did I leave anything out, Russ, Julia?
Maybe I'll add a couple things on the resettlement question in terms of the U.S. government's, the political will. And I think I agree with you 100%, Kathie, being creative with this private sponsorship program, trying to engage communities in a more proactive way. I've been in meetings with State Department officials who spearhead this effort from inside the government, and they are doing everything that they can with a divided Congress to get the funding that they need to execute this program. It's just so unfortunate that the program was decimated the way it was, during the Trump administration, and it's taking a long time for it to rebuild. So we have to be patient, but there's a lot of urgency there as well, right? Because the need is so significant. So I think we as advocates at least are trying to be as persuasive and aggressive as possible to make sure that those 125,000 slots are taken, while also acknowledging that there are limitations and needs a little bit more time. Breaking news is that we're hearing now, so the government fiscal year ends, as we all know, with the shutdown looming in just a couple of days. But there's also a deadline associated with that for the president to set his annual presidential determination. So basically that number of how many refugees will the U.S. accept in any given fiscal year, which starts on October 1st. And we just learned that the administration is sticking with the current number, 125,000. So, we are getting there, but hopefully in this new fiscal year, we will get closer to the 125,000.
From a historic perspective, I think it's important to point out that the U.S. refugee admissions program was never a political issue. It was always a bipartisan law, and that, in fact, and when it comes to presidential determinations, I think that there were two presidents who set the presidential determination at the highest at the time, and they were two Republicans, Ronald Reagan and George Bush. So this humanitarian issue has been diluted to become political, and it is the refugees who are suffering as pawns in this political game. So just to say, anyone says it's political, point out it's humanitarian. And we've been at this since 1948.
Just one very brief addition, which is to sort of to put a point on Kathie's original point. I believe in July, we resettled over 6,800 people through the State Department program, and in August, that number was 6,100. So if we were to hit somewhere between those two numbers, for a monthly average for a year, we would be approaching 80,000. I'm not one to shy away from critiquing any administration. And I also think these numbers are headed in the right direction. I think the one thing that I struggle with, and I know we're going to get to that, I think, in a little bit, is on the one hand, humanitarian parole is an important tool in these very challenging moments of time. And also, because it doesn't have a pathway, at some point we have to figure out what the pathway is for the folks that come here from those particular situations, right? Like we have Afghans that have been here since September of 2021 who we're trying to figure out what the long-term solution is, and there's continuing efforts to extend the road that they're on without actually turning that road into a way they can stay here permanently without worrying about status. Like, that hasn't happened yet. And so it's true, Kathie's perspective that there have been a whole bunch of additional people that have come in through US programs that were not the State Department program. And also, like, we need to figure out how we make sure those folks have the opportunity to make the United States their home, if that's where they want to be.
One of the programs that Russ was referring to is the Afghan Readjustment Act. Russ, since you alluded to it in your remarks, what impact will this have on the safety and security of our Afghan brothers and sisters if this is passed? And why hasn't it been passed yet, even though the refugee crisis from Afghanistan started in August 2021?
Why indeed? That is a great question. So the Afghan, for folks that, you know, just to like make sure we're keeping everybody on the same page, the Afghan Adjustment Act would basically create this pathway to permanent residency and then citizenship that Afghans that are here under the humanitarian parole program do not presently have, that there's presently no way for them to do that. And this would create that opportunity for them. And it was based on the idea of, you know, other previous instances where there was this sort of immediate big migration in part from a military conflict. So, you know, there's I believe the Cuban Adjustment Act is one of the pieces of legislation that this was based on. And it is a piece of legislation that, and folks have been arguing for. In fact, some of Kathie's neighbors and some of the local leaders that HIAS works with and folks that work with Kathie have been pushing hard for this since before the evacuation, right? So in the spring of 2021, I was having conversations with leaders about what is the plan? Is there going to be some sort of adjustment act? We need to be focused on this and think about this because it doesn't seem like there's a plan in place. In terms of the why, I think there's, I mean, to put it bluntly, I think there are a few key holdouts in Congress, in the Senate, that are the biggest obstacles to this. I've been in justice work for a long time, over 20-something years, in a variety of campaigns, different organizations doing different kinds of organizing, federal, state, and local. The coalition, the broad coalition of people who are interested in seeing the Afghan Adjustment Act get done is one of the broadest from a geographic perspective, from a political perspective. You know, you've got organizations of faith like Julia's in mind. You've got organizations, you've got veteran organizations, chambers of commerce, labor unions. You know, you're getting op-eds from Fox, from the Wall Street Journal, as well as other places, and stories that are covering this. It is really a broad-based coalition. And right now we're up to 14 co-sponsors in the Senate, 7 of each side of Democratic and Republican. I believe, Julia, if I got this number wrong, please correct me. I believe we are at 42 co-sponsors for the Afghan Adjustment Act in the House. And again, split up that way, 50-50. So we've got, what's clear is that if there was a vote, this thing would pass. So it's a question of building enough momentum and exploring all the different avenues to find a way to get around the roadblocks and get that vote. And that's sort of where we are now with it. And I think that a thing that people can do is to continually let your members of Congress know that you want to see this pass, because our issues, and I know that I'm sure that both Julia and Kathie could say a lot more about this, but one of the challenging things about these issues is we work to build up public support on them, because there are a lot of issues that are being advocated for. There are a lot of different groups that are doing this advocacy work. And the organizing that we're doing, the voices that we are raising in standing alongside refugees and asylum seekers and folks who are speaking out, like, we can be powerful allies if we speak up for folks, because we're adding to their voices in a way that our issues don't necessarily get the same amount of public outcry. I don't know if that feels like a fair frame, but I don't think we don't get as many people into the fight. And that's why, that's why all three of us work so hard to try to get more people into the fight, because we know that these are issues that seem clear cut, cut and dry. This is the right side of history to us, but we need more people to stand up and push elected officials that way, because that's what elected officials react to, is who's putting the pressure on, right? Who's connecting with them and who's connecting them with the issue.
Yeah, I would just second your characterization, Russ, that this has been an incredible coalition that has, rallied together to support the Afghan Adjustment Act. Just hearing the co-sponsors, right? The fact that it's balanced and that's intentional. The lead co-sponsors on both the House and Senate side, they want to project this reality that it's bipartisan, and so they don't want to bring on a lot of Democrats, for example, so that it outweighs the Republicans. So it's very intentional that only one Democrat at a time, one Republican at a time, so that it's balanced. And there's no reason why this legislation should not pass. That frankly, I think it's gotten caught up in politics again, where there's this hesitation related to the Biden administration and how it handled the withdrawal from Afghanistan, a bit of that, and then a bit of skepticism or perceived skepticism around the vetting and the security checks that were conducted during the evacuation process. Those are some of the hesitations I've heard from the members of Congress who are holding this legislation back. So again, absolutely, we need to keep pushing as advocates to argue, for this legislation. It's unfortunate that these individuals have been here for 2 years. They are clearly contributing to their communities. They're working, they're going to school, they are trying to integrate and rebuild their lives. There have been no issues around that, and all they want is peace of mind, and we're not able to give them that without this Adjustment Act moving forward. This sort of tentative parole situation that's extended haphazardly. Some of them are trying to apply for asylum, but we've already talked about how complicated the asylum system is. So this will be an important way for us to demonstrate the fact that we value the contributions that Afghans have made to the U.S.'s policies in the past, and that we're ready to accept them here in the United States.
Can I just speak to the audience with something very specific? Russ has been leading this grassroots group for 2 years now, Russ? Focusing on issues. And if you want to see what you should be advocating for and want to understand issues, go to HIAS's advocacy work and look at it. And they'll give you plenty of opportunity to write your senators, reach out to your congressmen, just follow them. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can do that. And we happen to have brought a stack of postcards for our advocacy work that says things like, don't build bridges. I don't know if they're in there, right, Chris?
Yes.
Lori, probably holding them up right now. And these are postcards you can write your messages and you can send to your members of Congress, your senators, your representatives. And listen, we know the New York members of Congress and senators are very favorable toward refugees, and I'm not even sure who has co-signed the bill. But the point is, even validating their support is important. So please do that. They like to know they really took the right step in doing that. So we're going to leave you hundreds of postcards, and you can talk and send this about the Afghan Adjustment Act. And then there will be other opportunities for advocacy to support refugees throughout the year. And we'll leave those beautiful postcards with you.
Well, thank you. And just looking at the time, I know we're running a little short. So why don't, Kathie, thank you for the actionable items you mentioned. Julia, does JRS have any actionable items that Manhattan College students can get involved in advocacy?
Yes, and similar to HIAS and other groups, we are working on these issues day in and day out from a staff perspective, but also mobilizing students in particular at Jesuit universities, high schools, parishes, and any other community that's interested in working with us on this issue. I had a one pager that I sent over late to Chris. So if there's a way for Chris to get that out to you, I think he's going to try to do that. But we have ways for you to sign up on our website to receive our action alerts, which we send out periodically that will prompt you to send an email to your policymaker on a particular issue. And we typically focus these issues around resettlement, around overseas funding for overseas humanitarian assistance, supporting the Afghan Adjustment Act, protecting asylum here in the United States. So a lot of the issues that we've talked about today. And then certainly encourage people to join us throughout the year during our various campaigns. We host an advocacy day in Washington, D.C. every spring, typically March, April timeframe. So I would welcome participants then as well. So several ways that you can support some of this work through JRS.
Russ, how about HIAS?
So a lot of what Julia just said, right? We're working on a lot of the same issues, but I think right now the biggest thing that folks can do, this feels really timely and important. So the three of us, we were all talking a little bit about the shutdown, the government shutdown that is pending as we were getting ready to get started. And we're really concerned about the shutdown from several perspectives. We're concerned that, so for folks that don't know, the federal budget, right? The government needs to pass a budget or some sort of budget resolution to stay open. If it doesn't pass that, there are some services that have to continue to run, but much of the government will slow down or shut down, or people will be furloughed. There's a really significantly reduced capacity. There are a few pieces of this that really are concerning to me and to us at HIAS, and I'm sure also to JRS and to Hearts and Homes. So, the biggest piece is we're concerned that this is going to be in part an attack on international humanitarian aid, that is a target in the budget from the House leadership, the House side of things, that's going to be significantly slashed or eliminated. And that aid is in part what helps, cover the cost of the programs that HIAS and I'm sure JRS and other organizations are doing around the globe in terms of education, in terms of economic development, psychosocial support, fighting to stop gender-based violence, right? These are the programs that are just some of the things that we're doing around the globe. So that's a first real concern. The second real concern is that government shutdown will mean that it will start to, not immediately, because people who already have their flights, it's not going to be like previous shutdowns where flights are not going to be immediately canceled, but it is going to mean that the processing of people who are looking to come to the United States through the State Department is going to slow significantly just because of staff. And a third thing that we're concerned about, a not so secret third thing, as is the parlance of the day, is we are really concerned that there are some elements of the House majority that are going to use the budget fight to try to sneak in even more draconian measures around asylum rights and the border. And they're going to use this opportunity to try to push some of those things through that they could not push through without having this weapon of a budget shutdown, of a government shutdown. So one thing that folks can do now, right, and then the next couple of days, is you can reach out to your members of Congress, all three of them, both your House of Representatives, your representative, and your two senators, to tell them that you want to see them make sure that the government opens, that the government does not shut down. However, you don't want to see them do that at the expense of these key programs, because there's going to be a lot of pressure to just do whatever they can, do whatever you can to get the government going again. And we've seen in moments like this that there's a danger that a deal may be cut that impacts our programs, impacts humanitarian aid, impacts the border. And so we really need to raise voices to let members of Congress know that we need them to stand. We need them to fight to keep the government open, but we need them to also fight for that humanitarian aid and for support for domestic resettlement and to protect asylum seekers and their rights at the border.
Well, thank you to the three of you for being here, and why don't we give our speakers a hand? So, does anyone in the audience have a question for the speakers? Seeing no questions, thank you, Russ, Julia, and Kathie, for partaking in Refugee Advocacy Week. It has been a pleasure. This is the final event for this week, so we're hoping to do some more advocacy initiatives throughout the year. One is from now until November 17th, we are doing a winter hat and gloves drive. You could drop the hats off in the social action suite downstairs. We're collecting them for Catholic charities to distribute to the migrants that are coming up from the southern border, because they don't really come up here expecting how cold New York gets and how snowy we get. So if you can, please pick up an extra hat while you are out shopping and help us. Thank you, guys. All right. Thank you, Russ and Julia and Kathie. It was nice seeing you three again.
Thank you for having me.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us. It's great to be here.
Nice to be with
Yes.
you too. Thanks, Chris.
And yes, I'll stay in touch.
That's good. Bye.
Bye-bye.